Welcome to Talking Academia. Today I'll be talking to Leib. Leib is an MPhil student at University of Cambridge, studying history and philosophy of science and medicine. Hi Leib.
Hi.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Did I say your degree correct?
Yes, it is a very long title, because when you look at the official title on the degree, it is the History, Philosophy, and Sociology of Science, Technology, and Medicine.
Whoa.
Because there's a lot of different ways that people approach the study of science, and there's a lot of different parts of science. The main ways that that history of science breaks up sciences into science, technology, and medicine. So it covers a lot of different parts, and a historian of medicine often does very different things from a historian of science. But that's just how things have evolved over time. But yeah, it's a lot. And you put together that with the art history side, which is usually history of art and architecture, is what it is.
So what do you do in this broad range of disciplines?
That is a good question. By training, I'm both a historian of science and a historian of art. My background in history of science is the modern physical sciences. So that means physics, chemistry, geology, those sorts of sciences from roughly the mid-18th century up to today. In art history, my background is in classical art history, so Greece and Rome especially, but due to the way that my undergrad program worked, there was only one person that was teaching that field, and she left halfway through my degree, so I sort of branched out. I did a lot of art conservation classes, and so I got very interested in art conservation, the type of technical work that's done in art museums. So today, my work tries to integrate those two fields. I am interested in how those laboratories first formed in art museums, in the techniques that they use, and in the unique challenges that these sorts of scientists face. At first, these were people that were chemists, that were sometimes physicists or geologists. They weren't specialized in looking at art. Sometimes they were archaeologists, but not always. And they came to the field through interest in art, but they weren't specially trained in art conservation. Nowadays, people are specialized art conservators much more often. So they go through specialized training, looking at methods for dealing with artwork specifically. The big thing to consider with artworks is you're usually not allowed to touch them. They're delicate. Unlike a lot of other types of scientific work, you can't take samples very easily. They don't want to destroy the artwork. Sometimes they're really delicate. And then the other part of the work that is really done in art museums is restoration. People think of especially like the renovation of the Sistine Chapel ceiling 20 years ago, taking off layers of smoke from 200, 400 years worth of candles burning, and all of the technical considerations that go into that, which come down to how do we get to what was originally put down by the original artist and not take that away while getting rid of all the dirt and whatnot. So in a nutshell, what do? I am a historian, so I deal with things from the past. I am interested in ideas, in people, theories, and especially objects. I find those sorts of things. I sometimes am in the archive, where there's records, lots and lots of texts, especially that people haven't looked at. I read through all of them. I get interested in what they're talking about, or I'll see an object in a museum and I'll ask, has anybody talked about that object? And more often than not, no, they haven't.
Wow. How do you overcome the problem when you're not allowed to touch the paintings or imagine the objects as well? How do you overcome that?
That's a very particular problem, and it really depends. In some parts of art history and archaeology, it's less of a problem. I've worked in the field in ancient Greek temples, and those ones, when you're doing the excavation, you have to be dealing with the objects, and it's accepted that you will damage them a little bit, and that accidents happen. and that the excavation process is invasive. And so when you're dealing with something like marble sculpture, which is what I was doing a lot of work with in the past 2 years as an undergraduate, it's much easier to deal with. Marble is very stable. The biggest danger is dropping it and breaking it. But chemically, it doesn't change too much over time. It does a little, but it doesn't radically change over the course of 50 years. The time scale for marble changing is a few hundred years, if not a few thousand. And that's just that the surface changes. It oxidizes. Or sometimes it does other things, but those are more unusual. With other types of artworks, you can't ever touch them. The more recent you get in art history, generally speaking, the more delicate works can get, because the materials change, and also because those delicate artworks tend to only last a little bit of time, so those delicate artworks from today are the only ones of their type, of the ephemera that we have. I was at a conference on art conservation, and someone asked a art conservator, what's the worst thing you've ever worked with in terms of delicacy? And he said, oh, it was human urine that was painted onto a steel plate. Urine is very volatile. It makes lots of gases. The chemistry breaks down rather quickly, and so conserving it is a nightmare beyond the fact that it's nasty. So that's its own unique challenge. Sometimes you have to deal with the surface to stabilize it. That's especially common with paintings, works on paper. The canvas, the paints, pigments, paper, they change over time. Pests get into them, so you have to try to stabilize them, and so you have to intervene. The credo of modern conservators is to make changes that are reversible and clear, that they are interventions, so that it's not difficult to tell what's original and what isn't. And then the other part is using methods that don't require physically touching artworks. These are a lot of visual methods, so spectroscopy is the big one. Raman spectroscopy was a huge development. Similarly, XRF, which is X-ray fluorescence, and other X-ray related techniques were very useful. All of them were allowed you to take a look at different layers of the artwork and also get at least some information about the chemical and physical structure of the materials that make up an artwork. So X-ray fluorescence, XRF, shows you what elements are creating an artwork. So you can say, oh, if there's arsenic, that means that there's a specific type of paint that uses arsenic. That's not always the answer, but then you can use a more recent method like Raman spectroscopy, which shows the full molecule. So that gives you a really good idea of what's being used in the materials of a painting. And so as you can tell, most of the work that's being done right now on this sort of technical analysis of artwork is asking what materials were used to make an artwork, and how can we reconstruct the techniques that artists used to make them. There's work on, say, terracotta figurines, and they often show with really precise detail the surface, so you can take the little indents or creases in the terracotta and reconstruct the little wooden tools that were used to carve lines or details into them, and some people have tried to do that. And the whole point of this sort of research is to get a better idea of how artists were working, how they made their masterworks, because we don't always have that information. Oftentimes that's very secretive, how artists operated, and sometimes you get insights that you weren't expecting, like with marble. Returning to that example, you get insights from studying what marble quarries provided the marble for a given sculpture or a given temple or whatever work you're thinking of. And some of the insights that have come out of that research is that usually artists travel with the marble, and artists are working with local marble. So if you have a piece that you think is Italian marble, and then it turns out it's Turkish marble, well, that implies that the artisans that made it, or at least the ones that were doing some of the work, the roughing out of the main details, of the main features before a master artisan would come and put in the details, that is, were locals. They were, instead of the Italians you thought they were from Asia Minor in the Greek and Roman example I'm thinking of. That's happened. There is a specific type of marble from Götepe in modern-day Turkey that is chemically and physically almost identical to Carrara marble, which is the best-known marble from Italy, which means that a lot of examples that we have today that we think are from the Central Roman artistic workshops probably came from Asia Minor, which might require revising our ideas of the trade between the Roman capital and the outer regions, and other features of how artists were traveling as well, because sometimes they traveled with the marble when their works were going from the local region to somewhere else.
Was this what your undergraduate thesis was about?
Yes, so I was working at the Harvard Art Museums, and I asked the ancient department if I could work for them. I asked them if they'd done any scientific work, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've done some analysis of our marbles." I said, "Great, what have you done?" They said, "We have no idea," because they hadn't cataloged the work. So I just went through reading all the records and writing up what they had done, and most of it was this kind of work trying to identify what quarry provided the stone for a given artwork. And I became curious. I asked, why did they do this? And that question was what I attempted to answer in my undergraduate thesis.
Did you answer it?
Yes. The main answer was, like I said, trying to identify useful information that came out of this sort of, you would almost consider basic scientific research. It's very applied in that you're looking at for a specific answer, but it's also not always evident what directions the research will take you. People working on marble are a very specific community. There's one association really that works on this, and so my thesis tried to also look at the history of this association, why people in the early 20th century especially got really interested in this question, how a group of geologists and archaeologists came together and tried to put together a set of standards for a very small field, when people hadn't really been asking those sorts of questions about artworks before.
How about your master's thesis here now? What are you doing now?
I'm working on Japanese woodblock prints, specifically the use of synthetic dyes in the prints by an artist named Tsukioka Yoshitoshi. Yoshitoshi was born in the 1840s. He became an active artist really around the time his master Kuniyoshi passed away in the late 1850s to the early 1860s, before the Meiji Restoration. And he became known very quickly for what were called bloody prints, which were named for a very good reason. He used a lot of red to create these bloody scenes of warriors killing people, of a whole series of depicting different murderers set to verse. This particular one that I've shown a lot of, criminal Naosuke Gombe ripping off the face of another man with his bare hands. It's grotesque, and I became very interested in this artist because I looked at him and I said, wow, those are such different themes compared to other woodblock print artists. The most common genres or subjects to show were living people, kabuki actors, geishas, prostitutes living in the red light district of Edo, what is now Tokyo, were really popular topics. But they were restricted. Just as Yoshitoshi was being born, a very restrictive set of reforms were passed by the Tokugawa shogunate government. They were called the Tempo reforms. They restricted not just what could be shown in artworks, in prints specifically, but also how those artworks could be made. On the one hand, kabuki actors, living people, couldn't be shown in prints, but also you couldn't use more than 8 colors in any given print, and they couldn't be larger than a certain size, a triptych made out of 3 large sheets of paper. And so I've been interested in this idea of how woodblock print artists innovated, because it was only after these reforms that the last major genre of woodblock prints came out. Yoshitoshi's master, Kuniyoshi, developed a whole genre in response to these legal reforms. He couldn't show living people, so he went to another popular category, literature and mythology, and he created these so-called warrior prints, which were really popular. They were bought in massive quantities. He went through multiple editions of prints, and he was able to get around a lot of the legal restrictions while still slipping past censors, which had to approve any artwork that was being made at the time. And so Yoshitoshi, his student, did something similar at first. He was showing interesting scenes from mythology, from earlier Japanese history, but he also went further. He didn't just show mythology, he really got interested in monsters and the dark side of mythology from Japan, but he also innovated in the materials. And this returns to what I was talking about with those reds, with the representation of blood when there's just so much on the paper, so much red. And for people who've looked at a lot of prints, they ask, how did he do that? Because red in Japanese prints before that were usually not a very deep color. And the reason for that is because most inks and dyes that were used in Japanese prints prior to the 19th century were all made out of plants or sometimes mineral dyes. Plant-based dyes especially will fade pretty quickly. And there's a well-known case of this with a study of blue in Japanese woodblock prints. The study that was done by a Japanese art historian at Columbia named Henry Smith was asking the question, why does blue suddenly show up in the 1820s in Japanese woodblock prints? And the answer was twofold. On the one hand, they realized it didn't suddenly appear. It was just that blue prior to the 1820s was made with Japanese indigo, which would fade in about 5 years. And so there are a number of prints that were pretty brown looking that were, when they were first produced, were blue. They just faded. And then those other blue prints from the 1820s on, think of the Great Wave, the really famous image from Japanese art. It's brilliant blue and it's 200 years old. So how did that color last? And the answer is artificial colors, particularly synthetic blue dyes like Prussian blue. People also call it Berlin blue. It lasts much longer. It was probably mixed with Japanese indigo dyes, and those blues suddenly came into the Japanese market and became really popular. So I got interested in this research. I said, is this the same thing that's going on with the reds? It's a little bit later. We're looking at about the 1860s. And so I just dove into the research. The literature starts in 1859 with Perkins, who was Harry Perkins, who was a English chemist. He had developed the first synthetic dye, which was mauve, which is a sort of purple-red color, and it became very widely used. It's also known as Tyrian purple. But it was Perkins' teacher, August von Hofmann, who had come over to Britain, who developed the second synthetic dye, which was rosaniline hydrochloride, which generally goes by the name fuchsine or magenta. People know magenta as a color, though it's kind of hard to pull out what's the difference between all these different versions of reddish, purplish colors, but if you look it up, you'll see it's based off of the color of the magenta flower. And so fuchsine was very popular. It was incredibly effective at making very deep colors. And so the first people that wanted to use them were textile manufacturers, especially French ones. And so it split off from there. French manufacturers started making it independently. There was a French chemist who synthesized the same dye almost contemporaneously as von Hofmann, this person was named Francois Emmanuel Vergoin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He also synthesized the same dye. He sold the patent, or was sort of strong-armed into the patent by a pair of brothers, the Renard brothers, who were manufacturers in France. So they started making the dyes. Some German companies started making the dye. And at this point, I'm still looking into how it got to Japan. Whose dyes were in Japan? Was it the French dyes? Was it the German dyes? We know it wasn't the French or German trading directly with Japan. The only country that was directly trading with Japan, that was a Western European country, that is, was the Dutch. So how did the Dutch get this dye? Was it the same traders, the same trade route as the Prussian blue? I'm still looking into this. There's large companies that still exist, like the BASF company, which were possibly the first ones to sell it to the Dutch, but it's hard to find. And then the other side that is also guided by this earlier research on blues is Chinese dye production, because not long after Prussian blue was traded from Western Europe to Japan, China started producing it, because they were most likely buying it from the Dutch traders as well, or they independently synthesized it themselves. So it's clear that these traders and chemists were all working in somewhat independent but somewhat related fields. Chinese chemists definitely were working with one of the components used to make this dye, aniline, which is derived from coal tar, at least by the 20th century. And they were probably working with it before. The question is, when exactly? So I'm still working on that.
Mm-hmm. But Yoshitoshi, was he the first one, or his paintings, are they the first ones in Japan which feature this Western red?
That's a great question, and it's something that I'm not going to be able to prove definitively. The studies that I'm relying on are from other museums, from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and I wasn't a part of the research team. This is one of the limitations of being a master's student rather than a PhD student. You have less time and you have less money. So if you want to do these kinds of collaborative technical studies that require teaming up with conservators, teaming up with a museum that has these artworks, that has the facilities to do the testing, it takes a while. And at this point, I haven't had enough time in a degree program to more or less lead a project like this, so I'm relying on work that's already been done. And from what the Met and the MFA have found, Yoshitoshi was at least one of the earliest to be using this specific dye. But it's not clear who was the first, because they just don't test that many prints. The largest number that they were testing was for Fushine, and they had 18 prints that they tested. That's not enough to draw general historical conclusions, but it gives, at the very least, a latest date when Yoshitoshi was using this dye, which was in 1864, which is only about 8 years after this dye was developed. But there are other studies. There's a study from art museums in Tokyo, which studied over 2,000 prints. And the reason they could do that was because they didn't have to take samples. They were just using photographs of these paintings, and then using photo analysis software, we're trying to pull out the specific wavelength of red to try to identify which dye was being used for that specific print. And so far as I know, that study also claimed that they were not a clear answer for when this dye was first introduced to Japan, but it's at least building up a body of literature. So we know that this dye was introduced around the first half of the 1860s in Japan. Just when Yoshitoshi was starting out as an independent artist, he had already been practicing for a number of years at this point as an apprentice, but it was just around this time he was becoming independent. And so it's the right time, but it's not a definitive answer yet. And then the other part of the mystery is who was buying this print. Yoshitoshi was a designer, so he would make these images that would ultimately turn into the prints, but he wasn't doing all of the work. There's carvers, there's printers, and there's publishers as well, who are involved with the process, and often it was the printers who had the dyes on hand, and at least some of the printers were the ones who were actually buying the inks. Yoshitoshi seems to have been involved in the process based off of fragmentary records, but no one's exactly sure. We don't have a smoking gun like a written diary by the people involved, any of the figures, saying, oh yes, today I went down to the market and I saw this new European dye that I was interested in. That would be great to find, but that would probably require a lot of archival work in Tokyo that, again, I just don't have access to right now.
That's what I wanted to ask about. Like, this process seems so interesting, and I can't imagine, how do you find this information? Is it mainly archive-based work that you do, or literature-based, or how do you look at, if you want to find out whether or who sold the paints and who bought them, how do you approach that?
They have different components to the research. So the first part is working with the objects. So that will involve talking to the museums, getting time in a study room, working with the objects if possible, otherwise looking at them in galleries. Because the first thing you need to do is just look at them very closely, try to pull out as much detail as you can, and then ask the museum what they have in their records. Sometimes they have things that are not printed or published, but they do have in internal records. Talking to the conservators if they've worked on these objects, because they generally have ideas. And then from there, looking at just the literature in general from art history. That's usually published literature, so going onto databases online, looking through the libraries, what's been published, and finding the different scattered parts of general art history that's talking about how these things were made and who were the people involved in the production process. And then from there, I will usually go online and start dealing with 19th and 20th century databases of different material producers and different laboratories. So since this work is relatively late into modern history, a lot of it has been digitized, which is really nice. So I can hop onto Google Books and I can put out a search for this specific dye, and there's usually at least some literature that's been fully scanned, so I can read through that and I have an idea of who's been talking about that at the time. Sometimes that will involve then finding these specific people, or sometimes finding really old analytical work that's been done by museums in their very early periods of research in the 1920s or whenever, and going to an archive to look at what a chemist has written when they did an analysis, or looking at what people thought about artworks when they were first bought by a museum, because sometimes that has information about who they bought it from, what their thoughts were at the time, and just who they talked to when they were getting these artworks. And so it's a bit of detective work, and it's a bit of guesswork. When I was first looking at these prints 3 years ago now, when I first got interested in this topic, I had to do a lot of guesswork about what dyes were being made at the time, because you could just look at the prints and say that's not the same color or the same material that's been used before. Something is different. So that would just require looking at the history of the chemical manufacturing industry and asking what's going on at this time. Were dyes being made? And yes, in the mid-19th century, that's when a lot of the first synthetic dyes were being made.
It sounds like there's a lot of integrating with all the different subjects. It sounds like you'd have to know something about chemistry, something about technology, about art and history. As I understand, your background is pretty mixed in this sense, but how well is it generally integrated, the knowledge of art and science?
It's becoming much more integrated. For both general public, in art museum exhibits, you see references to conservators in the text that they have on the wall for an artwork saying, our conservators did analysis and they found this material, which tells us these things about this artwork. And that's relatively new. Probably it's only really the last 20 years or so that you've seen this. The first integrated laboratories that were made for art museums, at least in the US, were around the early 20th century. The Fogg Museum at Harvard was one of the first that was focusing a lot on paintings. The Met in New York also had a sort of mishmash of conservators, restorers, and other people working in a loosely affiliated department that eventually became their conservation center. The European museums, I'm less familiar with their history, and there's been a bit less written from what I'm familiar with. And so this research has been going on for getting close to a century now, but a lot of it was looking at questions about restoration, conservation. How do we prevent artworks from degrading over time? How do we make sure that they're stable when we want to show them? But in terms of specific publishing by historians about this, it's quite new. This idea of technical art history as both a term and the actual field itself is rather new. Again, it really began in the 70s, but that's still kind of early, or late, depending on who you ask. Because in the International Congress of Art History in the 1930s, they were scientists presenting on work that they've done on artworks. But you also don't see this term, technical art history, emerging in academic literature until much later in the 20th century. And programs that specifically focus on it are also relatively new. There's Glasgow's, there's Amsterdam's, Yale has, I'm not sure if it's a full program, but they have resources that they've put together online for technical art history. So it's still really more a developing field than anything. And there's some debate over what exactly people are talking about with technical art history. Some people limit it to scientific publications written by chemists and other conservation scientists about artworks, which follow the format of a scientific publication. Some people are a bit more broad in their definition, thinking about the sort of work that applies these insights from scientists to historical work, going one step further and asking interpretive questions that are less definitive, they're less data-focused publications. But some people argue that that should be the core component of technical art history.
Mm. You also mentioned with integrating science and art, you mentioned NeuroAesthetics before. What is that?
NeuroAesthetics is a bit of a buzzword in different parts of the humanities and integrated science art studies that has been interested in the study of how people react on a neurological level to artworks, with the idea that if you start studying the way brains on an electrical, chemical, physical level are reacting when people are thinking about and looking at artworks, maybe we could develop insights about why people like certain artworks, what ideals about beauty people have personally or in general. So this field has attempted to construct a theory of aesthetics based off of insights from more neurological methods than anything in the study of art history. And it has had a very mixed reaction, split between different groups. Some art historians are very against it. They say this is hogwash. You can't make an objective theory of aesthetics. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy, and it doesn't meld with hard data-driven sciences. On the other hand, there are people that claim, well, there are these patterns that we're seeing in the way people react to our experiments that seem to suggest general reactions to art that we could, in theory, draw conclusions people in general react this way. There is probably more a lot more that can be said about this field. And probably at a later point of time, I will need to investigate this more. And historians, if they start getting interested in this type of work that's at the crossroads of art and science, will start to ask, well, what's going on with this field? Is this actively putting together methods from the two fields, or are they sort of mashing them together without actually trying to field equally the questions from both disciplines? There have been studies of especially the work of Viennese artists, because those artworks were developed in the 20th century, just around the time that Sigmund Freud was very popularized, and psychoanalysis was certainly one way that people have looked at and analyzed art before. So the question is, well, why not take the contemporary successor of Freudian psychology, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry, and try to apply neurology, neuroaesthetics to art?
What are your views on it, on combining art and science?
I think it's really difficult, because this idea of making neuroaesthetics, it's playing on this idea of aesthetic theories from philosophy, and the fact that people just don't agree on art because, at least from the perspective of the long view of philosophy, people disagree because it's opinion-based. It's very difficult to say objectively people find this beautiful. And some features that neuroaesthetics or just other studies of beauty from a neurological perspective have looked at are things like symmetry, how colors are organized, and showing that people in general do react to those sorts of features positively, especially things like symmetry. So I'm skeptical because I'm not sure how well integrated the neurology side is with the aesthetics side. There are definitely teams that are putting together scientists and art historians and writing very good work on these artworks that they're studying and the theory that is pulled out of it, but I'm not sure that it is substantively different from being a theory of aesthetics. Making a scientific theory in philosophy is something that people have tried to do in other fields, in other branches of philosophy as well. And some have been really successful, see analytical philosophy, and some of them are just haven't been attempted. I mean, people haven't tried to branch the gaps between certain parts of philosophy just because it didn't really make sense. People haven't made a lot of work in, for example, bridging the divide between aesthetics and, say, philosophy of science. That would be, in theory, useful for my work, but I don't have an idea of what that would even look like. I'm not a philosopher of science. I work on the history of science, but history and philosophy of science are very closely integrated, as the department here would certainly argue. So, to answer your question, I'm not sure at this point because the field is so new. And I'm just not sure what the people working in it would point out as their key achievements. And once that sort of emblematic work of the field has been really carved out, then I think it would be more fair to look at it and say, oh, yes, these insights are really useful. And I'll never say that these types of integrated studies are not useful. Often it's the attempt to make two disparate fields cohesive that can be really useful. It doesn't have to be asking a new research question, but asking how to communicate ideas between different fields is a completely valid question in academics today.
It's great to hear how the two different areas of science and art are being integrated, both in terms of the technical art history and neuroaesthetics. It's been very, very inspiring. Thank you very much. Just to wrap up, I wanted to ask, if people now get interested in Yoshitoshi and his work, what would be a good way to get started, or what should we read about it? Where, in which museums can we have a look at his prints?
There are a very large number of collections that have at least some pieces by Yoshitoshi. In England, the British Museum, the Fitzwilliam Museum both have relatively large collections. In the US, the collections I've worked with are at the MFA, the Worcester Museum of Art in Massachusetts, and at the Met in New York. But there's a lot more than that. Yoshitoshi's works have been circulated throughout many art collections, partly because prints were made in very large quantities. You're talking sometimes thousands of prints, so thousands of copies of the same artwork, so a lot of them survive. And so just searching up online, you will see sometimes the same artwork, but from two different runs, two different print runs, and so you'll see different details. Sometimes one has much more color than the other, sometimes a different figure will appear. And it's also worth saying that Yoshitoshi's artworks are still being auctioned today. Japanese woodblock prints from throughout the long time, from really the 17th century all the way through today that they've been produced, they're still being actively sold, they're still being made. Sometimes even reproductions of historical prints are being made. Sometimes they're quite expensive though. So if somebody wants to pull up Yoshitoshi's works, there have been exhibitions that have been done on him, especially through the British Museum, that have then resulted in publications. There's a few online resources that have been made as well. In terms of actually seeing the artworks, sometimes the online copies or facsimiles are not that good. You won't see all the details that you could see in person, but it's a good place to start. There's some English language literature that's been done on Yoshitoshi that can be found pretty easily. Though some of the major works would need to be accessed since it was written by a PhD student for his dissertation. That might take a little bit more digging and requesting through an interlibrary loan system. But there are a number of places that you can look. So just starting online is the best place you can see it. Google Art Project has at least a handful of high-quality images of Yoshitoshi artworks that you can get started looking at. The MFA's website tends to be relatively good as well. And then talking about Yoshitoshi's life, the Fitzwilliam Museum's website has a small series of web pages talking about his life, his work, to give you a better idea of what he was like.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So if you get interested in Yoshitoshi's work, you know where to find it. Thank you for watching, and next video coming out on Thursday. Like, share, subscribe. Yay, bye.